Guess we're underway then. Yeah, hi everyone. As I just said, my name is Matt. I'm a debater from the LSE, and today I'm going to be talking about how to give useful feedback to teams as a judge. So I'm going to talk over how to prepare yourself to give good feedback and set yourself up for success. Then I'm going to talk through some general heuristics for giving good feedback. And then if we have time, and I assume we will, we'll go into questions. Before that, I think one disclaimer to note that I note at the start of a lot of workshops that I give is that you should view these things as heuristics. They're guidelines, they're not prescriptive. I think that everyone has their own communication style, and this should be seen as like a way to help, not a strict guide. So adhere to this as closely as you can, but not to the extent that it is inhibiting your own communication style, and take what you can get from it rather than feeling like this is something that you must do. Additionally, I know most people also speak as well as judge. So I think it's important to note that you shouldn't ignore feedback that isn't given in this way. Some of the best feedback I've ever received as a speaker came from people who gave feedback in some of the strangest of ways. And similarly, I've gotten very well structured feedback that was also not very useful. So this should be just a word of warning to not just discount feedback that comes from people who might not be as polished or might not be giving feedback in this specific style that I outline here. Before I get into that, though, I'm just going to go over some basic notes that I think are useful on how to prepare yourself to give good feedback before the debate or during the debate. The first thing to note is that during the debate, you should take notes in such a way that you can easily reference different parts of your speeches when asked to reference them by speakers. This happens a fair bit, right? You get a speaker that comes up to you after a round and they're like, what did you think of this specific part of my speech where I said X thing? And then you have to look through your notes and you're looking around for a while and you're kind of digging through. It's very important, I think, to note the most important parts of each speech so you can easily reference specific parts of speeches when asked about them. So the way you do this if you're taking notes on paper is you highlight or underline key points, or you have a separate sheet where you list key arguments made by speakers. Both of these are things I've done in the past. They're both, I think, useful. If you're taking digital notes, like on a laptop or like electronic mobile device, you should otherwise like bold or otherwise indicate key parts of the speech in order to make sure you've taken that down and you've made careful note of that. Secondly, I think it helps if you have some thoughts on individual speeches noted down as well beforehand. So I think that one thing that you should always do is note like what approximate speaker bracket you think a speech fell into. So like 80, 81, for example, how many speaks you would give the speech. And if you think that the person outspoke their partner, or you think anything else is relevant, it's worth writing it down just as some like meta commentary on the debate as you're going through that. And I think spend some time thinking about why you think those speeches fall into a specific speaker category, or why you think that a speaker outspoke their partner. All of these things help prime your mind to get into the sort of headspace where you're better able to give feedback at the point at which the debate concludes and at the point at which you start talking to individual speakers. The third thing I think that's worth noting, and I do this sometimes as well, is just to explicitly record notes that point out key bits of feedback, as long as it doesn't detract from your tracking of the debate. So what I mean by this is actually explicitly writing out, speaker did this, they could have done this better, or speaker did this, there's room for improvement here, writing out some specific sentence that reminds you to come back to it if the speaker ends up asking you for feedback. Now, obviously, if it's the case that a speaker is like difficult to track, or you just having a difficult time following the speech for whatever reason, it's worth noting that this isn't like mandatory. It's just like worth doing if you have the time to do it or the ability to do it. Once the round is concluded, though, and you finish giving your OA and you've explained the call and the round, the next thing you then do is actually deliver that feedback. And it's worth noting that a lot of the time when speakers ask for individual feedback, they're not looking for you to recap the OA. If you've done a good job, the OA should have already made relatively clear the 6 splits and the comparisons and how each of them interact with each other. Now, sometimes speakers will come up to you and ask for clarification on the OA. That's perfectly fine. And in that case, you should be repeating things from OA. You should be using skills you've drawn on from OA workshops in order to explain those splits and so on and so forth. But what I'll deal with here is when speakers want constructive feedback on how to improve. The upshot of all of this is I think you should be concise, precise, and accurate with the feedback that you're giving. I generally like giving very targeted feedback. That is 1 to 2 things at the absolute most, or 3, I guess, if you're being like incredibly generous. Any more than that tends to overwhelm speakers. I don't like to do that. And it detracts from overall ability for them to improve. So what I try to do is I give 1 to 2 things, to work on, formatted in a very specific way. What I say is something like X thing was good, it could be improved by doing Y, therefore allowing your speech to do Z. In other words, your mechanization was good, it could be improved by adding some redundancy into the mechanisms to make sure the mechanisms are strong and independently reinforcing each other rather than being somewhat contingent on each other, therefore allowing your speech to be more resilient to rebuttal, for example. Or your framing was good, it could use more illustration about what the world actually looks like rather than the abstract hypotheticals you're giving, therefore allowing your speech to be more persuasive to the average wing judge who might not buy the mechanism and might be more persuaded by illustration. These are just a couple of examples of ways you can go about giving feedback in a very concise and targeted manner. Beyond that, though, I think there are a few things to note that are useful. And some of this is very basic, but bear with me while I get through it because I think it's worth noting. A big part of giving feedback that's useful, I think, is your demeanor, right? If you seem receptive to giving feedback, it's more likely people are going to internalize it. If you seem approachable and generally friendly, it's more likely that even criticism you give is going to be taken well. Similarly, it might be really basic to say this, but when you're giving feedback and you want to be critical of a speaker, it's usually worth giving some words of praise first, like noting that they did something decent in the speech before going into sort of critiquing the speech and pointing out where you think it fell short in the round or where you think it could improve if they took like the win in the round or something like that. Teams, when they're approaching for feedback, generally approach with a few different things in mind. Some, as I already pointed out, just want further clarification on the OA. If that's the case, I will refer you kindly to other workshops in this seminar that basically talk about how to give good OAs because it's the same skill set. Just cross-apply those skills about how to explain how teams ranked in a round to the individual feedback that you're then giving teams. But somewhat further justification as to why they lost that goes beyond the OA. They actually want a more illustration as to why specific things that they said weren't credited, for example. Some want genuine feedback and improvement on how to get better, and somewhat more specific notes on like a skill they've been working on. I guess some are also just like really salty, but that kind of overlaps with the first category of people. Obviously, not everyone who asks for clarification is salty. Some are. It's like a subcategory, I suppose. How to best address these people then depends on kind of the situation you're in. If a team wants further clarification as to why they lost, it's important, I think, as a judge, not to seem frustrated by this. I think it's worth noting that most people are approaching in good faith. And if there is a genuine clarity issue and they want explanation, it's very well within their rights to do so. There have been occasions where I'm giving OA and I realize something I said wasn't entirely clear, or maybe I didn't do the best job explaining why a team happened to place under another team in a split. And then when the team comes for feedback for clarification and something didn't make sense to them, I realize after talking to them for a bit, they had a point and I go into some detail about it. So it's important to assume that the team isn't just being randomly salty or randomly upset. They actually have a point. They misunderstood something. They want you to go into more detail about it. So given that most people are genuinely seeking help and want to improve and understand your rationale, you should answer their questions respectfully and directly. And it's also worth noting that teams often will ask very specific questions here. Like teams will hone in on specific mechanisms. And I think the reason they do this is because often teams have a perception of the round hinging on a few key things that they said, particularly if it's not something that's spoken about in the OA, and they'll want to know why that specific line of mechanization or specific thing that they said either wasn't credited or how they could make it more creditable if it was credited well. And in this case, I think it's important to view this as a normal part of the process and not a personal attack, right? It's just a natural part of the game for speakers to want these very personalized mechanisms. And this is something that's more obvious in some circuits, I think, than others. But it's worth noting that this is like incredibly common globally. So as a judge, you should get used to it. So yeah, it's not a personal attack. People want to improve. That's sort of the first thing. If they have queries about specific elements of their speech, it's important not to seem too frustrated. They might have just had a different idea of the content's importance compared to you and want clarity on that. Some things I think that can be helpful in order to provide that clarity. First, I like to point out the burdens that arguments possess internally to the way the arguments are constructed. What I mean by this is that a lot of speakers, when they're speaking, will implicitly or explicitly set a metric or burden for themselves in the way in which they're explaining the argument. A good example of this was at a tournament I debated at like a year ago almost. where a motion was about grain deals and Ukraine. So like whether or not Ukraine should make deals with the EU in order to export grain to the EU at a lower price or something like this. And teams made two sets of arguments in this debate. Some teams made arguments about how this will be a tipping point that will end the Ukraine war in favor of Ukraine. Some teams made arguments that instead were arguing sort of a lower burden claim about why Ukrainian economy would grow. Now, intuitively, the claim about the Ukrainian economy growing has a lower burden than the argument about the Ukrainian war ending, because one quite intuitively has many, many more things that have to go right for Ukraine in order for a grain deal with the EU to be the one single thing that would end the war. So often the way teams construct arguments implies there is a burden to those arguments, and often confusion that teams have stems from them believing they met a burden that they did not in their speech, or that they proved something exclusive to their side that isn't actually exclusive to their side and then is called out by other teams. So I'm not saying intervene, right? But I'm saying often teams will not pay attention to the internal burdens of their own arguments, even if they're called out by other teams down the line, because everyone is calling each other out, everyone's responding, and so on and so forth in debates. So they might not be pointing out these specific terms of rebuttal. So that's the first thing you can do, point out those internal burdens. The second thing I think that's useful is to use the language the teams use when explaining their arguments to them. So I think a lot of the time judges fall into the trap of explaining arguments using their own language and reconstructing the debate in a framework that they create, right? Because you as a judge have your own perception of the round that is distinct from the speaker, because the speaker is a speaker in the debate and they're perceiving the round from their first person perspective where they're arguing. You're perceiving the round from a sort of God's eye view where you can see the whole debate and you can see everyone within the debate and how the arguments interact with each other. Therefore, I think you have a much clearer perspective, or at least a more holistic perspective, than individual debaters will have about the round. What that means is that often you're liable to using different language than the speaker when re-explaining the case to them. And this can lead to a clarity issue where the speaker feels they haven't been heard or they haven't been understood properly because something in their analysis was unclear, or something in the way you explained their analysis rather was unclear. So what you can do in this context is be very careful to note down at least a few words of the specific terminology that teams are using. That is, if the team is using the term race to the bottom to describe a mechanism of competition, then you can use the same term in your OA and also in delivering feedback, right? If a team, is using specific words or phrases to describe a specific phenomenon, then use those phrases when you're explaining how these processes work. Finally, if you genuinely feel, after a team has been talking to you for a little while, that you missed something or you just didn't credit an argument very highly or you discounted it, that's also fine. But it's important to be honest about this. Once you're honest about this, then you can explain why you didn't feel that content was the most important thing in the round. Often, what you can do in these contexts is say, look, I didn't think this was as important as you did. I didn't think this was as useful, but I do think that if you had said it in this way, or if you had expanded upon this a bit, then it would be more useful in the debate. So then you can explain why you didn't feel the content was the most important at the end. So that generally, I think, are ways to handle conversations with teams who want further justification on why they lost, if something wasn't clear to them in the OA, and they want more analysis on how to improve as a speaker. If a team is genuinely very salty with you and they're coming up to you and they're like genuinely kind of aggressive, in these contexts, obviously, there are a variety of ways to handle this situation, some of which go beyond the judge workshop and venture into equity territory. But insofar as you want to provide feedback that's useful and helpful, and you want to mitigate damage to your adjudicator score, if you think that's something that you care about, stand your ground and have confidence in your call and in your justification. Ultimately, it was their job to convince you. If they failed to do so, it's not on you, right? So you have all the right to explain to them, and you ought not just, retract or back away as long as you're comfortable going toe-to-toe with that person. But at the same time, explain fairly why they lost, why you felt like your call was correct and justifiable. And if the conversation goes in circles or you feel like it's not becoming productive, feel free to cut it and walk away. At that point, you're not gaining anything by continuing the discussion, right? So that's generally how I handle teams that want further justification for why they lost. For teams that want feedback and improvement on how to get better in general, here it's also important to be concise, precise, and specific, as I already talked about. Often there's a lot of things that you can give teams to take away from a debate. And often I've seen judges fall into the trap of just saying buzzwords. Oh, you could have done more weighing. You could have done more framing, or you could have done explicit bench weighing here, right? All of those things might be fair criticisms of a case, but they're not in the abstract going to help a team improve very much. What I like to do here is I like to be, again, very specific about one or two skills I feel were lacking in the team's speech that could have shifted their speech either up a bracket or shifted them one position in a debate. So if they won, how they could get 79 to 82 instead of like a 76 or 78. Or if they lost the debate, how they could get first instead of second. So if a team is asking a question in a very general sense of how to improve, stick to one or two themes and try to give very specific and targeted advice in that manner. It's worth noting as a speaker, you can also help speakers by doing this, right? You can help judges by doing this. You can ask very targeted questions about improvement. Like you can ask, is my framing decent here? Can I get better? How would I do X better than Y, right? And these questions are very easy to answer because the speakers are usually going to really pinpoint what they want answers for in that regard. If they don't do that, of course, then in general, try to keep it to like one or two concise things, as I already said. If a team wants specific notes on some skill they've been working on, this is fairly straightforward. Obviously, give it to them. But if this skill, or if you feel that this skill was not decisive in the way in which the round played out, it's worth noting that that's useful to convey to the speaker. So many times when I'm judging rounds, speakers will ask me, how could I have been more stylistic, or how could I have been, had better manner presenting this speech? And that's a fair question, right? Like obviously manner is important and style is important, right? But in specific rounds, it might not be the decisive factor in whether or not you won or lost. So it can be useful to point out to speakers that wasn't the reason you won or lost. It just happened to be something you could do better. And that will also insulate you from feedback from a team who's like upset them that you told them that they could improve more if they just did this thing. And that wasn't like the actual key thing that their speech hinged on for them to win the round. So in these contexts, answer their question, but point out whether you thought it was relatively important or unimportant in the round. And obviously, if it's like something helpful to them, there's a reason they're asking for it, give it to them, but be sure to convey how much you thought it influenced the margin in the debate. So to recap a bit before we do Q&A, I think a lot of giving good feedback is being adequately prepared. So take notes in such a way you can easily reference them, think about individual speeches and write down notes about individual speeches. When you're giving feedback, try to have a positive demeanor, seem receptive to giving feedback, seem friendly, seem likely to be open about it and give criticism that is well taken and mixed in with words of praise, and try to generally address people who are genuinely seeking help directly, concisely, and precisely. A few miscellaneous things before we do Q&A. One thing I like to do, I think it's just a nice thing to do, and I'd like to see it become a norm in the community, is if you have multiple teams asking you for feedback, work up from the fourth to the first. So if every team wants feedback, start with like the team that placed lowest within the round. If like the third asks you for feedback and the first, start with the third, then move on to the team that placed first. Go reverse chronologically. If a team in fourth and third and second and first, I'll ask you for feedback, right? So I think this is useful just because often the teams that place the lowest in the round probably feel they have more of an urgent need for feedback and probably are more desperately seeking clarity on why they lost or how they could get better. Whereas teams that placed first are generally more happy they placed first, even if they don't understand some specific things. So I think that's like a norm I want to encourage. So if you're judging people, you should do that. The second thing I would note, and this is just again, as a sort of general rule, is when you're giving feedback and when you're conveying different things of improvement and ways to improve, try to be careful not to over much hint at speaker scores or things that could be interpreted as a leak or things that could be interpreted as you giving away a bracket. I know some judges have done this thing recently where they'll like literally use the words from the bracket to explain how a speech went. I don't like doing that personally because I think it's cheeky. You're either leaking, or if you're not leaking, then you're like giving speakers odd hints about the speech their round fell into, or the bracket their speech their round fell into. I think you can say the speaks reflect that this was a good debate, but I wouldn't go more specific than that in general in that specific context. In any case, that's all I had written down. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. I do think we have a little bit more time, like 3 to 5 minutes, because we started like 10 minutes late. So I can take a couple questions if people have questions. If not, also happy to let you guys go. All right, amen. Cool.
So sometimes, but very rarely, albeit, I think the feedback to a team is like run a different case, but like teams tend not to take this in very good faith and or think it's kind of like you shirking your responsibility. So like what is the best way around giving that feedback?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that generally, as you might intuit from some of the things I've said earlier, it's best to first address very concisely how they could improve the case they ran. What I like to do in this context is I like to start with a disclaimer and say, look, I don't think that this is necessarily the most strategic thing you can do because, and then you give the reason why you don't think it's strategic. But then you say, this is how you can improve this case. And this is what you would have needed to do to win with this case on its own merits. With that being said, I think there are other more strategic approaches you can take to this debate. And I'm happy to talk about that if you're interested in hearing about it. That then puts the ball in their court to ask how they would improve their case or what you'd run differently. And then without being prescriptive, without you seeming like you want to desperately tell them what you would have run instead. So start by giving them feedback on the case they ran to improve it to the degree to which it can be improved, because usually people aren't making perfect arguments. Even if they're making arguments that are suboptimal, there are still ways you can critique that argument to make it better. And then give the disclaimer and say, look, it's probably not what I would have run. Here's how I can do it better. Does that make sense? Cool. Here's how you can do it better, rather. Yeah.
I have a question.
Go for it.
Okay, so it's about giving judges feedback. So most of the time we have to basically write down comments of the things. So it is problematic. Or the problematic part here is that one, we basically give some sort of like bullet points or like saying that they have no less amount of engagement or like uh, uh they can't find loopholes here. I think that what the problems comes here that this doesn't basically reflects or well, doesn't give any proper sort of idea of how what I'm trying to say about the particular panel or judge. So in end of the day, when it's trying to see how basically I am reflecting or saying about that particular judges, most of the time Adj Core seems wrong or basically misunderstood as because they are saying that might be that judge basically don't just finding the things but couldn't give me more sort of reasoning. So in end of the day, that judge basically ignore my feedback. So how basically I write down the feedbacks, which is very important. It is also crucial about the teams to basically how reflect because most of the teams basically do the same things or just giving the scores and think that they have brackets and at CA team will see the brackets and see what the basically feedback they want to try to say now. This most of the time basically doesn't give any sort of improvement here. So what could be the crucial suggestion from you for teams and judges both?
So the first thing is that most majors and most minis too have scales And those scales are posted in the competition Discord servers if it's online, or if it's in person, there's usually a briefing that has the scale included. You should use those scales when giving feedback as a speaker and as a judge. So as a judge, when you're scoring panelists, you should be using those scales and you should be reading those scales to understand what specifically they say. Many people don't, though, you're right. And given that many people don't, that does create issues. But that being said, best practices are to use those scales. In terms of your specific questions, what's important to note about giving feedback to panelists is that often it's very round specific. So if you're giving feedback to a panelist on how to improve, or if you want feedback to be taken seriously by the CA team, they both rely on the same underlying principle, which is you should write one thing about the judge's reasoning that you felt was either lacking or good. And that one thing should be the thing you highlight at the start of your feedback in the most concise way possible. Most CAs are not going to read the feedback as diligently and as thoroughly if it looks like a multi-paragraph essay that seems like annoyed with the team, for example, or annoyed with a judge. In those contexts, what's most important is you give an accurate score and a short, concise sentence or a short, concise series of sentences that the Adj Core can easily internalize and that helps them scoring the judge. And then include your recommendation where you'd put that judge. So should they panel? Should they chair? Should they be a trainee? Where should they panel? Should they panel high room, low room? Should they chair? These kinds of things, high room, low room. These kinds of things are very useful for Adj Cores, right? The same underlying principle applies to giving feedback to judges when judges ask you, how could I improve as a judge? But here, what's most important is to, again, isolate a specific point of improvement, i.e. how they contributed to the discussion. Could they talk more? Could they be more specific with their tracking? Could they be more specific in commenting on team rankings? Could they have been more concise with, explaining things? Those are the kinds of things that are most useful in terms of awarding judge feedback. The other thing I'll just note about judge feedback in general, I think this is useful. The number one piece of advice I give to judges, almost every panelist that asks for feedback that I've given at least once, is you could have been more concise and more precise and more accurate. These are like the three most important things for panelists. You should do the comparison the judge asks you to, be as concise as possible about it, be as accurate as possible about it, and then when asked for further clarification, explain your rationale, but no further. That is like number one piece of feedback. You can almost never go wrong giving that piece of feedback to wing judges at tournaments. There's often room for improvement there. If that's not something you want to give as feedback, obviously you don't need to, but that's like something I think very easily that you can offer as feedback when judges approach you for these kinds of things. I don't know if that answers your question specifically, if you have further clarification on that, but that's generally my approach to leaving feedback as a judge on judges for Adj Cores, and also when I'm giving feedback to wing judges when they ask after rounds. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Cool, no worries. I think we have time for one more question, then I'll let you guys go because I know there's other sessions today. Cool. Well, in that case, I think that we are good and done. Thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. If you found this helpful, please feel free to reach out to me on Facebook if you have any further questions at a later point. I'm happy to take them. Or if you just want to talk about judging further, I'm also happy to do that. My DMs are open. With that being said, I hope you have a great rest of your day and you enjoy the rest of the workshops this weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.